I am Harrison, 32 years old. Exactly 3 days after I stood at the altar and promised to love and cherish my new wife, she picked up a heavy crystal vase and swung it directly at my head, fully intending to crack my skull open. While I was sitting in the harsh, flickering fluorescent light of the emergency room, watching her play the weeping, terrified victim to a local police officer, her millionaire parents marched through the double doors. Her father, Winston, pointed a trembling, manicured finger at my face and screamed, "You are a violent, worthless thug, and I will use every dime of my real estate fortune to make sure you rot in a prison cell." He said it loud enough for the entire waiting room, the nurses, and the security guards to hear, fully intending to humiliate me and establish his dominance. But there was one massive, catastrophic detail Winston did not know. He firmly believed his generational wealth made him completely untouchable. He didn't realize I was the silent majority shareholder of the parent investment company that held his entire commercial real estate empire together. And now they are the ones begging for mercy. Before I tell you exactly how I meticulously dismantled their perfect little world and exposed their lies, hit that like button if you believe the truth always comes to light, no matter how much money tries to bury it. And please, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Your support means the world to me. Now, let's go back to where this nightmare actually began. The first swing never connected. That is the crucial detail people always struggle to comprehend when I explain how my marriage violently ended before the ink on our marriage certificate was even completely dry. They expect a story of blind panic. They expect me to say I ducked in terror, ran out the front door, or that I simply stood there in absolute shock and took the hit, just like society often expects people to do when faced with sudden, unexpected domestic violence from a partner they thought they knew. Instead, just 3 days after I said my vows in a breathtaking botanical garden, surrounded by imported orchids, a live string quartet, and her wealthy relatives sipping $300 champagne, I caught my wife's wrist mid-swing. I used her own violent, forward momentum to smoothly guide her away from my face, and she went down hard onto the kitchen tile. She hit the floor, her ribs colliding sharply with the edge of the lower mahogany cabinet. The massive crystal vase she was holding, a ridiculously heavy, ornate heirloom piece gifted by my late aunt, shattered into 1,000 glittering pieces across the expensive, custom-laid hardwood floors we had just picked out together for our luxury downtown apartment. Her name is Valerie. My name is Harrison. I want to tell you how a woman who spent 14 grueling months perfectly playing the role of a sweet, understanding, and supportive partner turned into someone actively trying to take my head off over a stolen wedding fund. I want to thoroughly explain the anatomy of a betrayal so deep, so profoundly calculating, that it genuinely makes you question your own sanity and your ability to judge human character. When Valerie hit the ground, she let out a sound I had never heard a human being make in my entire life. It was a sharp, breathy gasp that immediately morphed into a high-pitched, piercing wail. I did not freeze. My heart rate barely elevated above its normal resting pace. I calmly reached into my pocket, pulled out my phone, and dialed 911. My hands were completely steady. I was not operating on fear, and I was certainly not operating on anger. I was operating on a deeply ingrained, almost mechanical instinct. The emergency dispatcher answered on the second ring. I gave our exact address in a clear, measured tone, stating unequivocally that there had been a physical altercation initiated against me, that the aggressor had fallen and sustained an injury, and that an ambulance was needed immediately. Valerie just lay there among the broken crystal, clutching her side, staring up at me with this look of absolute venom, betrayal, and utter disbelief. She fully expected me to cower. She expected me to drop to my knees, beg for her forgiveness, and apologize profusely for daring to defend myself against her attack. Her entire life, from childhood to adulthood, had been a continuous series of people bending over backward to accommodate her tantrums and shield her from the consequences of her own actions. I was the very first person in her 30 years of existence who simply stepped out of the way and let gravity and her own malice do the work. The paramedics arrived within 10 agonizingly long minutes, accompanied by 2 seasoned police officers wearing heavy-duty belts and incredibly stern expressions. The moment the first responder stepped through the door, Valerie flipped a switch. The venom in her eyes vanished, replaced instantly by wide-eyed terror. She began hyperventilating, putting on an absolute masterclass of a theatrical performance, sobbing uncontrollably about how terrified she was, claiming her chest hurt and she couldn't breathe. They carefully loaded her onto a stretcher and wheeled her out. Officer Jenkins, a tall, observant cop with tired eyes, stayed behind in the apartment with me. He asked me to walk him through the exact sequence of events, step by step, without leaving anything out. I did exactly that. I did not raise my voice to sound defensive. I did not exaggerate a single detail to make myself look better. I pointed to the shattered vase on the floor, the dent in the cabinet, and the exact trajectory of her swing. I explained the argument about the missing money that precipitated the attack. He took meticulous, detailed notes on his small notepad. He asked if I wanted photos taken of my face or arms to document any defensive wounds. I politely told him no, because her swing never actually managed to hit me. He gave me a long, calculating look, paused his writing, and mentioned quietly that in his 20 years on the force, it is almost always the calm ones who are telling the truth, while the loudest ones are trying to cover something up. But he informed me standard protocol dictated that a detective would follow up with both of us at the hospital. When I arrived at the urgent care waiting room an hour later, driving my own car in absolute silence, the narrative had already been completely rewritten and heavily edited by Valerie and her family. She had spoken privately to the intake nurse and Detective Briggs, a grizzled, cynical veteran who looked like he had seen far too many messy domestic disputes. Valerie had painted a masterpiece of a lie. She completely omitted the missing $15,000. Instead, she claimed we had a minor, trivial disagreement about paying off some leftover catering expenses, and that I had suddenly snapped, shoving her violently and without warning into the kitchen counter. She turned on the waterworks, squeezing out giant crocodile tears, flawlessly playing the fragile, terrified newlywed whose husband had suddenly dropped his mask to reveal a violent monster. Then, the heavy double doors of the emergency room swung open with a loud bang. Winston and Beatrice, Valerie's parents, stormed into the waiting area like they owned the hospital and everyone in it. Winston is a man who wears his generational wealth like a heavy, blunt weapon. He owns a massive regional logistics and commercial real estate empire, and he firmly believes his exorbitant net worth gives him the divine right to dictate reality to everyone around him. Beatrice is the kind of woman who treats waitstaff at exclusive country clubs like they are invisible furniture, speaking only to complain. Winston instantly spotted me sitting quietly in the cheap plastic waiting room chair. He did not ask what happened. He did not pull me aside to ask for my side of the story. He crossed the room in 3 massive strides, his face purple with absolute, unfiltered rage, and unleashed a deeply humiliating public tirade. "You are completely done?" Winston spat, standing aggressively over me, invading my personal space. "I am going to file a massive, crushing lawsuit against you. I will personally drain every single penny of your pathetic little salary. I will hire the most vicious, bloodthirsty lawyers in this state, and I will make absolutely sure you lose your job, your leased apartment, and your freedom. You laid hands on my daughter. You are nothing but a violent, gold-digging animal." I did not argue. I did not raise my voice to defend myself against his slander. I just looked up at him, absorbing the absolute arrogance radiating from his pores. I noted the expensive cut of his bespoke Italian suit, the heavy gold Rolex on his wrist, and the absolute unshakable certainty in his eyes that he possessed the power to crush me like a bug. Detective Briggs finally stepped in, placing a firm hand on Winston's chest, asking him to calm down, lower his voice, and step back or face removal from the premises. But the damage Winston intended to cause was already done. The seed was planted deeply and firmly in the detective's mind. This was clearly a case of a wealthy, highly respectable family defending their innocent daughter from an aggressive, financially unstable new husband who was likely after their vast inheritance. Exactly 2 days later, I was sitting alone in my car outside a local, independent coffee shop. The brutal July heat was suffocating, baking the asphalt parking lot, but my hands felt like blocks of ice against the leather steering wheel. I was staring blankly at a thick, intimidating stack of legal documents a uniformed sheriff's deputy had just handed me through my rolled-down car window. It was an emergency temporary restraining order. Valerie had officially filed it against me. She was officially claiming, under penalty of perjury on the public legal record, that she actively feared for her life and physical safety. I read the heavy document from top to bottom, scanning every fabricated line, every twisted truth. It legally barred me from returning to my own luxury apartment, the one I paid 70% of the rent for. It demanded I immediately surrender any firearms, which I did not even own. It painted a picture of a man I did not recognize, a volatile, explosive abuser. I placed the heavy paperwork carefully on the passenger seat. I looked at my tired reflection in the rearview mirror. I did not feel broken. I did not feel the crushing, paralyzing despair they so desperately intended for me to feel. Instead, I felt a cold, hyper-focused, calculating clarity wash over my entire being. Winston and Valerie genuinely believed they could bury me alive with endless paperwork, blatant intimidation, and wildly expensive legal maneuvering. They thought they inherently had the upper hand because they operated under the assumption that I was just a regular, upper-middle-class guy pulling down a modest paycheck who would be easily and quickly bankrupted by a drawn-out divorce and a brutal legal battle. A small, grim smile slowly crept onto my face, not out of joy, but out of a deep, profound sense of impending justice. They had absolutely no idea who they had just declared a total war on. They were playing a sloppy game of checkers, relying on brute financial force, while I owned the entire damn board. To truly understand why I didn't panic when that heavy crystal vase came hurtling at my head, and why Winston's aggressive, public threats rolled off my shoulders like water, you have to understand the man who raised me. My father, Marcus, was not a wealthy man by any traditional American metric. He did not have a sprawling, diversified stock portfolio, a massive trust fund hidden in offshore accounts, or a bloated 401k to fall back on. He was a retired public high school wrestling coach and a man who understood the physical, mental, and psychological mechanics of the world better than any Ivy League professor or Fortune 500 CEO I have ever met. He passed away exactly 5 years ago from a sudden heart attack. At his packed funeral, standing in the back of the humid church, I realized just how many angry, lost young men he had quietly saved from the streets, simply by teaching them discipline, respect, and how to control their own bodies. His booming, steady voice still lives rent-free in my head every single day, guiding my decisions in boardrooms and in life. When I was 12 years old, going through a phase where I was being bullied by older kids in our neighborhood, we spent countless grueling hours in the dusty, uneven backyard of our modest suburban home. We were not throwing a baseball or bonding over fixing an old car. He was teaching me how to fundamentally shift my weight. He was teaching me the absolute core principles of leverage, balance, and momentum. "Harrison, listen to me," he would say, his heavy, calloused hands resting firmly on my young shoulders, forcing me to look him directly in the eye. "The world is absolutely full of entitled, arrogant people who think volume, money, and unearned aggression make them strong. They are sloppy. They will swing wide. They will use their anger and their momentum to try and break you down. Never, ever meet force with force. That's a loser's game. You step off the center line. You guide their wild, chaotic energy past you, and you let their own arrogance and lack of balance take them straight to the ground." At the time, he was strictly talking about wrestling technique, about how to defeat a larger opponent on the mat. But as I grew older, went through college, and aggressively entered the cutthroat corporate world, I realized he was actually giving me a master blueprint for survival in a corrupt society. He taught me a rigid moral code. Never strike the first blow, never initiate the cruelty, but never, under any circumstances, allow yourself to be a victim. That core philosophy became the absolute bedrock of my entire life. It is exactly how I built my private business from the ground up, outsmarting competitors twice my size. It is how I navigated incredibly complex, high-stakes financial negotiations. It worked perfectly, until I met Valerie. I met her at a highly exclusive, invite-only charity gala raising funds for a children's hospital in downtown Chicago. I rarely attended these events, preferring to donate anonymously, but a client had insisted. Valerie was charming, highly articulate, and wore a sleek designer dress that probably cost more than the college fund my working-class parents had struggled for 18 years to save for me. She confidently introduced herself as an independent fine art consultant who curated collections for wealthy tech executives. I was instantly, undeniably drawn to her elegance, her sharp wit, and what I mistakenly perceived as her independent drive. For 14 incredible months, she played the role of the supportive, loving, entirely grounded partner flawlessly. She brought me gourmet coffee when I worked late nights analyzing market trends. She listened intently to my vague stories about building my firm, never pushing too hard for financial specifics. But looking back now, with the perfect, painful clarity of hindsight, the red flags were flapping violently in the wind. I was just too blinded by the deep, aching desire to build a loyal, traditional family of my own, something I had craved since my father died, to see them. I willfully ignored the warning signs because I desperately wanted the dream to be real. The clearest, most undeniable warning came during our very first Thanksgiving dinner together, held at Winston and Beatrice's sprawling, heavily gated estate deep in the affluent suburbs. The long, sweeping circular driveway looked like a luxury European car dealership, packed with vehicles that cost more than most people's homes. Inside, the massive, custom-built mahogany dining table was long enough to seat 20 people comfortably, adorned with silver cutlery and crystal glasses. Winston sat at the head of the table, carving the organic heritage turkey with an air of absolute, dictatorial authority. Midway through dinner, Winston turned his sharp, calculating, predatory attention directly to me. The entire table fell dead silent, waiting for the patriarch to speak. "So, Harrison," Winston said, taking a slow, deliberate sip of a vintage Bordeaux wine that likely cost thousands of dollars a bottle. "Valerie tells me you run some sort of boutique financial consulting firm. A little small business. That's cute. Good for you for trying to be an entrepreneur. But in the real, adult world, scale is absolutely everything. If you ever want a real, dependable salary, a real promotion, and a clear path to true wealth so you can properly provide for my daughter, let me know. I might have a junior management spot open in my regional logistics division. It would be a massive step up for you." He completely patronized me in front of his entire extended family. He was publicly marking his territory. He did not know I actually managed a highly secretive, aggressive private equity portfolio worth hundreds of millions of dollars. I kept my personal life and my wealth aggressively private. I drove a reliable 5-year-old sedan because I didn't care about impressing strangers. I lived in a comfortable but totally unassuming condo, and I dressed simply. I just offered him a polite, totally neutral smile, swallowed my pride to keep the peace for Valerie, and politely declined his incredibly condescending offer. Valerie kicked my shin hard under the table, glaring at me. Later, in the expansive hallway, she aggressively whispered into my ear that I should have been much more grateful, deferential, and respectful to her father's incredible generosity. Then there was the undeniable issue of Derek. Derek is Valerie's older brother. He is 35 years old, lives in a luxury high-rise downtown condo fully paid for by Winston, and hasn't held a real, tax-paying job since he dropped out of a prestigious university 12 years ago. He is the ultimate untouchable golden child of the family. During that same tense Thanksgiving dinner, Derek loudly and obnoxiously bragged about a wild, drug-fueled weekend trip to Vegas. Everyone sitting at that mahogany table knew Derek had a crippling, deeply destructive sports gambling addiction. Everyone knew Winston constantly, quietly bailed him out, draining hundreds of thousands in liquid funds that could have easily gone to legitimate family investments or charities to protect the family name from embarrassment. But absolutely no one dared say a word. Beatrice just smiled tightly, passed the gravy boat, and told Derek he was looking handsome but a little stressed, completely enabling his disastrous behavior. Whenever I tried to gently, privately bring up Derek's incredibly toxic, drain-on-society behavior to Valerie, hoping to have an honest conversation about boundaries, she would shut me down instantly. Her eyes would flash with sudden, irrational anger. "He's my brother, Harrison. Family takes care of family no matter what. We protect our own. You wouldn't understand because you don't come from this kind of fiercely loyal background." The ultimate test of our relationship, and the clearest, most terrifying view of her family's deeply manipulative nature, came exactly 1 month before the wedding date. Winston abruptly summoned me to his opulent, oak-paneled corporate office in the heart of the financial district. I sat across from his massive desk as he confidently slid a thick, legally bound stack of documents across the polished wood. It was an incredibly aggressive prenuptial agreement drafted by his ruthless, highly paid legal team. "Valerie stands to inherit a very substantial commercial real estate, Winston said, leaning far back in his expensive leather executive chair, steepling his fingers together like a cartoon villain. "I need to legally and permanently protect my hard-earned assets from outside opportunists. It is just standard procedure when marrying into a family of our caliber. Nothing personal, Harrison. You understand. Sign it or there is no wedding." He was looking me dead in the eye, calling me a gold digger straight to my face. He fully expected me to be highly offended. He expected a loud, prideful argument, or at the very least, a desperate negotiation to secure some sort of alimony or payout. Instead, I calmly reached into my tailored jacket, pulled out my own heavy brass pen, flipped directly to the final signature page, and signed my name on the dotted line without missing a single beat or reading a single clause. I honestly didn't care about his dirty money. I was marrying his daughter because I loved her, not his bank account. Winston looked genuinely shocked, his jaw dropping slightly, and then somewhat deeply disappointed that he didn't get to aggressively assert his financial dominance in a messy, drawn-out fight. He thought he had won. He didn't realize my signature on that document protected my massive, hidden assets from Valerie just as much as it protected his from me. To publicly prove our financial unity and our commitment to building a life completely independent of Winston's shadow, Valerie and I agreed in premarital counseling to open a brand new, completely transparent joint checking account specifically dedicated to housing our wedding gifts. We received incredibly generous cash gifts and large checks from my side of the working-class family and our mutual friends. When the dust finally settled after the extravagant, exhausting reception, we deposited exactly $15,000 into that specific account. The concrete, mutually agreed-upon plan was to use it strictly as a solid financial foundation for a down payment on a larger house in a quiet, family-friendly neighborhood with a strict HOA. It was supposed to be our fresh start. It was supposed to be sacred. 3 days after the wedding, we were supposed to be blissfully basking in the honeymoon phase, drinking expensive, freshly ground coffee on the balcony of our new apartment, casually opening the last of the physical wedding gifts, and planning our future. Instead, I was sitting alone at my laptop at the sleek marble kitchen island, logging into our joint banking portal to quickly pay the final, lingering vendor invoice for the extravagant floral arrangements Valerie had absolutely insisted on having. The bank's dashboard loaded on the screen. The balance stared back at me in bold, unforgiving black numbers. It wasn't $15,000. It was exactly $412. I blinked hard, thinking it was a glitch in the banking software. I refreshed the page. The number remained exactly the same. My heart started to beat a little faster. I clicked on the detailed transaction history, my mind racing to find a logical, innocent explanation. Perhaps a massive pending charge for the honeymoon flights? No. There was a single, massive wire transfer initiated late the previous night, moving over $14,500 to an external, untraceable routing number. An account I absolutely did not recognize. Valerie casually walked into the kitchen at that exact moment. She was wearing my favorite oversized college t-shirt, looking completely at ease, pouring herself a fresh cup of coffee from the glass French press. She looked perfectly relaxed, humming a soft tune. "Valerie," I said, keeping my voice dangerously calm, intentionally keeping the emotion out of my tone. "Where is the wedding money? The joint account is basically empty." She stopped pouring immediately, her shoulders instantly tensed, pulling up toward her ears. She didn't look surprised. She looked incredibly annoyed that I had noticed the missing funds so quickly, probably hoping I wouldn't check the account for weeks. She set the heavy glass pot down on the counter harder than necessary and leaned against the marble, crossing her arms defensively over her chest. "I had to move it, Harrison," she said, her tone suddenly dripping with intense, defensive condescension. Derek was in serious trouble. Real, life-threatening trouble this time. He got in way too deep with some incredibly shady underground bookies over an illegal sports betting app. They were literally threatening to come to his condo and break his legs if he didn't pay the principal by midnight. I had to help him out. It was an absolute emergency. You would have said no. I stared at her, feeling the floor completely drop out from under my feet. The woman I had legally married less than a week ago, the woman I had promised my life and loyalty to, had just coldly stolen our entire financial foundation to secretly pay off her deadbeat, addict brother's illegal gambling debts to organized crime. "You gave our wedding money. Money given to us by my family to Derek?" I asked, slowly standing up from the barstool, the betrayal making my chest tight. "Without talking to me? Without even asking my opinion or trying to find another solution? It's my family," she snapped loudly, her voice rising dramatically in pitch, filling the kitchen. "You happily signed a prenup saying you didn't want our money anyway. Why do you even care so much? Winston will easily replenish the account next month when his massive quarterly commercial real estate dividends come in. He always does. Stop acting poor, Harrison, and stop making a huge deal out of absolutely nothing." "It is a massive deal, Valerie," I countered, keeping my voice low but firm. "That was our money. Joint money. Trust. You committed blatant financial fraud 3 days into our marriage. You stole from us to enable an addict." I reached for my phone resting on the counter. "I'm calling the bank right now to report a fraudulent, unauthorized wire transfer. And then I am calling the police to report the theft. Derek needs to face consequences, and so do you." That was the exact spark that ignited the powder keg. Valerie realized in that split second that she couldn't manipulate, cry, or guilt her way out of this situation. Her family's lifelong strategy of simply throwing money at problems and expecting everyone to quietly bow down wasn't going to work on me. Her face contorted into an ugly, unrecognizable mask of pure, unadulterated rage. The sweet, loving facade vanished completely, revealing the deeply entitled monster underneath. "Don't you dare!" she screamed, her voice echoing violently off the high ceilings. She lunged across the kitchen space with terrifying speed. Her hand closed tightly around the thick, heavy neck of the crystal vase sitting on the island, the cherished wedding gift from my late aunt. She swung it with everything she had, utilizing her full body weight and twisting her hips, aiming directly for the side of my head. It was a blow meant to cause severe bodily harm. My father's training took over instantly, overriding any conscious thought. I didn't think about the fact that she was my wife. I thought about the trajectory of the weapon. I stepped smoothly off the center line, pivoting on my back foot. I brought my right forearm up in a rigid block, deflecting her wrist just before the heavy crystal could make contact with my skull. Her own violent momentum carried her aggressively forward, completely unbalanced by the heavy weight of the vase and her missed target. I simply guided her past me. She crashed hard into the lower wooden cabinets. The vase shattered violently across the floor. And then came the 911 call, the dramatic hospital visit, and the devastating, entirely fabricated restraining order that forced me out of my own home. I spent the night of the incident at a sterile, impersonal corporate hotel downtown, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing through every possible legal scenario and asset protection strategy. The next morning, at exactly 7 a.m., my cell phone rang, vibrating harshly against the wooden nightstand. The caller ID flashed Felix's name. Felix was my former business partner. We had started a boutique consulting firm together right out of college, grinding through the incredibly hard, lean years, eating cheap food and sleeping under our desks. I eventually bought him out for a very fair, generous sum 3 years ago when he wanted to move heavily into the commercial real estate sector. We stayed friendly. He had even been a groomsman at my wedding just days prior, standing right beside me. "Harry, man, what the hell is going on?" Felix said, his voice tight, rapid, and unusually nervous. "Winston just called my personal cell. He told me you beat the absolute crap out of Valerie last night." "Felix, that is a complete, fabricated lie. She attacked me. She stole 15 grand of our wedding money to pay off Derek's bookies. And when I confronted her and threatened to call the bank, she came at my head with a crystal vase." There was a long, suffocating pause on the line. Way too long for a loyal friend hearing the truth about a traumatic event. "Look, Harrison," Felix said, suddenly dropping the friendly nickname, his tone shifting to something cold and pragmatic. "Winston is a very powerful, very well-connected guy in this city's real estate world. He's absolutely furious. He's talking about burying you in endless legal fees. He's talking about ruining your professional reputation permanently. Just go to him. Kneel if you have to. Apologize profusely. Say it was a massive misunderstanding and you overreacted due to stress. If you try to fight this family, you are going to lose everything you've built." I gripped the phone until my knuckles turned stark white. Felix wasn't calling as a concerned friend checking in on my well-being. He was calling as a paid messenger. "Why exactly is Winston calling you, Felix?" I asked, my voice dropping an octave, turning to absolute ice. "He just reached out." Through some mutual corporate contacts in the real estate world, Felix stammered weakly, his lie incredibly transparent to anyone who knew him well. "He wanted to aggressively vet your character." I hung up the phone without another word. The sheer betrayal tasted like bitter ash in my mouth. Winston was already rapidly moving his expensive pieces on the board, trying to systematically isolate me, trying to use my own professional network against me to force a surrender. He thought he was playing chess with a helpless pawn. I didn't call Winston to grovel. I called Silas. Silas is not just a lawyer. He is an apex legal predator wrapped in a custom-tailored, three-piece Italian suit. We have been best friends since our freshman year at university, surviving brutal exams, bad breakups, and cheap ramen together. He now handles extremely high-stakes corporate litigation and incredibly messy, high-net-worth divorces for the city's corrupt elite. He knows where all the bodies are buried. "Silas," I said the second he answered his highly secure, private line. "I need you right now. Valerie just filed an emergency restraining order based on pure perjury. Winston is actively threatening to destroy my entire life and career." "Meet me at my office in exactly 20 minutes, Silas replied instantly. He didn't ask if I was secretly guilty. He didn't ask for the exhausting emotional backstory. He just started the legal timer. I sat in Silas's massive glass-walled conference room overlooking the sprawling, gray city skyline. I methodically laid out every single piece of evidence I had managed to gather. The printed bank statements clearly showing the fraudulent wire transfer to Derek's known associates. The exact minute-by-minute timeline of the kitchen argument. The absurd, heavily fabricated restraining order paperwork filled with Valerie's lies. Silas reviewed the heavy stack of documents, his sharp eyes scanning the text rapidly, his face completely unreadable. "Winston is trying a classic, textbook scorched earth tactic to starve you out financially and emotionally," Silas said, rhythmically tapping an expensive silver pen against the polished mahogany table. "He files the bogus restraining order to legally force you out of your own home and put you entirely on the defensive. He threatens a massive, frivolous civil lawsuit to quickly drain your liquid resources. His ultimate goal is to force you to settle the divorce quietly, walk away with absolutely nothing, and sign an ironclad non-disclosure agreement to protect his precious daughter's pristine reputation." "Felix called me this morning," I added, leaning forward, the anger still simmering. "He aggressively told me to grovel to Winston. He slipped up and said Winston had reached out to him directly." Silas raised a perfectly sculpted eyebrow. He opened his encrypted laptop and typed furiously for several tense minutes. Silas has incredibly deep, slightly unethical contacts everywhere in the city. He has friends in corporate IT departments, banking sectors, and competing law firms. 10 minutes later, Silas turned the bright laptop screen directly toward me. It was a forwarded, highly confidential email chain. Felix, in his infinite greed and sheer stupidity, had accidentally CC'd a mutual, disgruntled corporate colleague on an email sent directly to Winston's executive assistant. The email clearly outlined a lucrative consulting agreement. Winston had officially offered Felix a massive, multimillion-dollar commercial real estate development contract, a truly life-changing amount of money that would set Felix up for life. The unspoken but painfully obvious condition attached to the contract: Felix would voluntarily testify under oath in family court that I had a long, documented history of severe anger management issues and highly volatile, abusive behavior during our previous business partnership. My own groomsman, a man who had stood beside me at the altar just days ago, a man I helped build a career for, had completely sold me out for a construction contract. They are deliberately manufacturing a fake history of violence to legally support Valerie's restraining order, Silas said quietly, his voice dangerous. If they get Felix on the stand, and he perjures himself, it becomes his lying word against yours. But we have this email chain now. It heavily implies corporate bribery and blatant witness tampering. We keep this devastating weapon firmly in our back pocket until the perfect moment in court. But we desperately need an independent eyewitness for the actual apartment incident, I said, aggressively rubbing my temples to ward off an impending migraine. It's a he said, she said right now. And the official police report leans heavily toward her because of her highly theatrical hospital visit and the fake tears. Silas smiled, a sharp, incredibly dangerous look that made opposing counsel sweat. I already dispatched my best, most aggressive private investigator to your building early this morning. We spoke extensively to Mrs. Higgins. Mrs. Higgins is a 72-year-old retired middle school teacher who lives directly beneath the luxury apartment Valerie and I shared. She is notoriously nosy, complains at every single HOA meeting about heavy footsteps, and knows absolutely everyone's business in the entire building. And, I asked, holding my breath. She heard the entire thing, Silas said smoothly, leaning back, because your massive balcony windows were wide open to let in the summer breeze. She heard Valerie scream at the top of her lungs, "I'm going to smash your head in." She heard the unmistakable crash of the heavy crystal vase shattering before the heavy thud of Valerie hitting the floor. I let out a long, ragged breath I didn't know I was holding. So we simply subpoena her, and she testifies for us at the restraining order hearing. It's a slam dunk. Silas shook his head slowly, his expression darkening considerably. It's not that simple, Harrison. My investigator uncovered something else. Late yesterday afternoon, a large man in a tailored suit, perfectly matching the description of Winston's personal corporate driver, visited Mrs. Higgins's apartment. He handed her a thick, unmarked manila envelope. We strongly suspect it was cash, a massive amount of it. Winston is trying to buy her absolute silence or force her to change her memory of the events. The conference room went icy cold. Winston was incredibly systematic. He was plugging every single hole in his sinking ship with raw, untraceable cash. Mrs. Higgins was living on a very fixed, limited retirement income. Her late husband's pension barely covered her daily medication. A $20,000 envelope of untraceable cash could pay for her medical bills and groceries for over a year. Could I honestly blame a struggling old woman if she took the devil's money to survive? Will she actually testify for us? I asked, the anxiety creeping back in. She wouldn't give my investigator a straight, legally binding answer, Silas admitted, closing the laptop with a snap. She kept repeating nervously that she doesn't want any trouble with powerful, wealthy people. We are absolutely going to subpoena her, but if she gets on that witness stand under oath and suddenly claims she didn't hear anything, or worse, falsely claims she heard you threaten Valerie first, we are in incredibly deep water. It will look like you are desperately harassing an elderly neighbor to lie for you. Later that night, I was sitting alone in the dark of my sterile hotel room, staring blankly at the ceiling. My cell phone buzzed aggressively on the nightstand, lighting up the dark room. It was a text message from an unsaved number. I knew immediately, deep in my gut, who it was from. Winston. I hear from my sources you hired a fancy lawyer. That is cute. You have until exactly 9 a.m. tomorrow to permanently drop your ridiculous defense. Sign the divorce papers giving up all financial claims, and publicly admit fault for the assault. If you don't do this, I am making one single phone call, and your pathetic little investment firm will lose its primary financial backing by noon. I will professionally and personally crush you like an insect. Don't test me, boy. He actually thought my firm relied on external, easily frightened investors. He truly, genuinely thought he could effortlessly pull strings in the financial sector and completely dry up my working capital. He was operating on incredibly outdated, totally assumed information. He saw my modest lifestyle, my simple car, and assumed I was weak and vulnerable. I didn't reply to Winston's text. I didn't block the number. I simply stared at the glowing screen. Then, I opened my contacts list and scrolled all the way down to the letter K. I pressed call on a highly secure, encrypted number I rarely used outside of closed-door quarterly board meetings. The secure line rang twice before a deep, gravelly, incredibly authoritative voice answered. Mr. Harrison, it's late. What can I do for you this evening? Mr. Kensington, I said, my voice completely steady, devoid of any fear or hesitation. Kensington was the highly respected, public-facing CEO of Vanguard Holdings, a massive, multi-billion-dollar corporate umbrella corporation with deep ties in every major industry. What the general public absolutely did not know, what Winston and Valerie could not possibly fathom in their wildest, most arrogant dreams, was that Vanguard Holdings was my personal creation. I aggressively owned 60% of the voting shares through a complex, legally impenetrable series of blind trusts. Kensington worked for me. He answered directly to me. I was the ghost in the machine. I need a massive favor right now, I said, standing up and walking to the large hotel window, looking out over the city that Winston thought he owned. Pull up the extensive investment portfolio for Winston's logistics and commercial real estate company, the one that is heavily reliant on our regional freight contracts and our commercial leasing division. I heard the rapid clacking of a mechanical keyboard on the other end of the line. I have it right here on my screen, sir. Vanguard currently holds the primary high-interest debt on his massive new warehouse expansion project. We also firmly control the master lease on his primary distribution hub downtown. He is heavily over-leveraged. I looked back at the glowing screen of my phone, reading the arrogant text message from Winston one more time. The sheer audacity. The absolute, unearned entitlement of a man who thought inherited money made him a god among men. Kensington, I said, the absolute coldness finally settling fully into my bones. A predator ready to strike with lethal precision. Prepare the aggressive acquisition and immediate foreclosure papers. Trigger the hidden early repayment clause on his massive debt load. First thing tomorrow morning, we are taking out the trash. Consider it completely done, Mr. Harrison, Kensington said, his tone perfectly professional but carrying a distinct hint of dark satisfaction. I hung up the phone and looked out the window at the sprawling city lights below. The storm had finally arrived. Winston thought he was the one controlling the weather. He didn't realize I wasn't trapped in the storm with him. I was the one bringing the hurricane. The morning of the permanent restraining order hearing, the city was trapped under an oppressive, suffocating mid-July heat wave. The asphalt in the courthouse parking lot was radiating heat so intensely that the air above it was visibly shimmering. Inside, the county courthouse was the exact opposite. The industrial air conditioning was running at absolute maximum capacity, making the heavy mahogany doors, the echoing marble floors, and the long, fluorescent-lit hallways feel like the inside of a meat locker. I walked through the heavily guarded metal detectors with Silas walking right by my side. Silas looked like a predator in a custom-tailored navy blue suit, carrying a sleek, incredibly heavy leather briefcase that held the absolute destruction of the people who genuinely thought they could casually ruin my life. I was wearing a simple, conservative charcoal suit that I had bought off the rack 3 years ago. I did not look like a billionaire who held the fate of a real estate empire in his hands. I looked exactly like what they assumed I was. A desperate, terrified middle-class man who was about to lose his reputation, his savings, and his freedom. We entered courtroom 4B, a large room with high ceilings and heavy wooden benches. Winston, Beatrice, and Valerie were already seated at the petitioner's table. I took a long look at the woman I had married just a few weeks prior. Valerie was wearing a highly strategic, incredibly modest, high-necked floral dress. Her usually perfectly styled hair was pulled back into a messy, simple ponytail. Her face was completely devoid of her usual expensive, heavy makeup, making her look incredibly pale, fragile, and utterly terrified. It was an absolute masterclass in visual manipulation and courtroom theatrics. She was playing the role of the battered, fearful victim to absolute perfection. Winston sat directly behind her in the front row of the public gallery, flanked on either side by two incredibly expensive, aggressive corporate lawyers who looked like they billed thousands of dollars an hour just to breathe the courtroom air. Winston caught my eye as I walked down the long center aisle. He leaned back against the wooden bench, crossed his arms over his expensive tailored suit, and gave me a slow, predatory, highly satisfied smile. He was absolutely, fundamentally convinced that this was the exact day he was going to legally execute my character, drain my salary through an endless civil lawsuit, and completely ruin my entire professional life. He thought this was a formality. He thought he had already won. Judge Harper, a famously no-nonsense woman in her late 50s with a stern reputation for aggressively cutting through courtroom drama and manipulation, took the bench. The heavy wooden doors were sealed by the armed bailiff, and the court was officially called to order. Valerie's lead attorney, a slick, fast-talking man named Sterling, stood up first to deliver his opening statement. He painted a truly horrifying, entirely fabricated picture of our incredibly brief marriage. He spoke passionately to the judge about Valerie's substantial future inheritance, her delicate and sensitive nature, and how I had violently, aggressively manipulated my way into her wealthy family's life. He brought up the shattered crystal vase, completely twisting the narrative. Sterling claimed, with a perfectly straight face, that I had thrown the heavy vase at her in a blind fit of violent rage after she had gently, lovingly questioned me about the poor financial health of my small business. He stated that I was financially desperate, unstable, and a severe, ongoing threat to her physical safety. Then, Sterling called his very first witness to the stand, Detective Briggs. The grizzled detective took the oath, sat down, and read directly from his heavily biased police report. He heavily emphasized Valerie's hyperventilation at the hospital, describing in vivid detail the severe emotional distress she was exhibiting when he interviewed her in the emergency room. He painted her as a woman broken by sudden domestic terror. Silas did not object during the direct examination. When it was his turn to cross-examine, Silas simply stood up, buttoned his jacket, and asked Detective Briggs a single, highly pointed question. He asked if the detective had personally witnessed any physical violence, or if he had observed any defensive wounds, bruises, or marks on Valerie's body that corroborated a physical assault. Detective Briggs was forced to admit, under oath, that he had not seen a single scratch on her. Silas thanked him and sat down. Then Sterling called Felix, my former business partner, my college roommate, one of the groomsmen who had stood right beside me at the altar. Felix walked down the center aisle, his eyes firmly glued to the patterned carpet. He looked incredibly nervous. His face was flushed red, and a thin, highly visible sheen of sweat had formed on his forehead despite the freezing air conditioning in the room. He took the oath, his voice shaking slightly as he swore to tell the whole truth. Sterling led him through a series of carefully, meticulously rehearsed questions. Felix testified that during our long years building our consulting firm from the ground up, I had a notoriously short, violent temper. He explicitly claimed, under the penalty of perjury, that I had once aggressively thrown a heavy office chair across a boardroom during a minor disagreement over a commercial real estate contract. He further testified that I had repeatedly confided in him that I was deeply obsessed with marrying into extreme wealth to secretly fund my failing, debt-ridden business. It was pure, unadulterated perjury. Every single word was a calculated lie. My own friend was actively destroying my professional and personal reputation for a corporate bribe. Winston sat in the gallery, practically glowing with smug, arrogant satisfaction. He looked directly at me, raising a single eyebrow, aggressively daring me to react, to lose my temper, to prove their narrative right. I just sat completely still, my hands folded calmly on the heavy oak table, my face an unreadable mask. "Your witness," Sterling said, sitting down at his table with a highly confident, victorious smirk. Silas stood up slowly from our table. He didn't carry any legal pads or notes. He just walked calmly, methodically to the wooden podium in the center of the room. "Mr. Felix," Silas began, his voice incredibly smooth, deep, and deceptively gentle. "You just testified under oath that my client, your former business partner, is violently unstable and financially desperate. You also consider yourself a highly respected pillar of the city's commercial real estate community. Is that correct?" "Yes, I do," Felix stammered, gripping the edges of the witness stand. "And you are absolutely certain that you have absolutely no financial incentive to lie to this court today? You have no pending, lucrative business deals with the petitioner's father, Mr. Winston, who is sitting right there in the gallery." Sterling instantly jumped up from his chair, his face red. "Objection, Your Honor. Relevance. Mr. Winston is not the petitioner in this restraining order case. His business dealings have absolutely nothing to do with this domestic violence hearing. It goes directly to witness credibility, financial motive, and potential bribery, Your Honor." Silas shot back effortlessly, not even looking at Sterling. "Overruled. The witness will answer the question," Judge Harper commanded, her eyes narrowing as she looked at Felix. Felix swallowed hard, looking quickly and desperately over at Winston in the gallery before answering. "No, I have no financial incentive. I am just here telling the absolute truth about Harrison's violent character." Silas turned his back to Felix, walked slowly over to his leather briefcase on our table, and pulled out a single, crisp sheet of paper. "Your Honor, the defense would like to formally submit Exhibit C into evidence. It is an incredibly detailed, highly confidential email chain, properly authenticated by our forensic IT team, containing a multimillion-dollar real estate development contract deliberately and explicitly offered to this witness by Winston's executive assistant. This email was sent exactly 12 hours after my client was officially served with this fabricated restraining order." The entire courtroom went dead, terrifyingly silent. You could hear the hum of the air conditioning. Felix turned the color of chalk. Sterling aggressively snatched the copy of the email from the court bailiff, his eyes widening in absolute panic as he frantically read the highlighted text. "In this specific email chain," Silas continued, his voice now booming with absolute authority across the silent courtroom, "it explicitly and undeniably states that this massive, life-changing financial contract is entirely contingent upon favorable character testimony in family court today regarding my client. Mr. Felix, did you honestly, truly believe that selling out your best friend and committing felony perjury for a real estate promotion would stay a secret forever?" Felix completely broke down on the stand. He looked desperately at the judge, stammering uncontrollably, frantically trying to backtrack. He claimed it was just a massive misunderstanding, a coincidence of timing, that he hadn't formally signed the contract yet. But the damage to his credibility was utterly catastrophic and irreversible. Judge Harper's face turned to absolute stone. She aggressively struck her gavel, ordering Felix to step down from the witness stand immediately. She bluntly informed him, on the public record, that she would be permanently forwarding the official transcript of his perjured testimony directly to the district attorney's office for a full criminal investigation. Winston's smug, arrogant smile instantly vanished, replaced by a look of sheer, panicked fury. He realized his money had just created a massive legal liability. But Valerie's lawyer, Sterling, wasn't completely done. He scrambled desperately, trying to salvage the rapidly collapsing narrative to justify his massive retainer fee. "Your Honor, despite this incredibly unfortunate misunderstanding with the witness, The fundamental fact remains that my client, Valerie, was violently attacked in her own home. As is common in these tragic cases, there were no other witnesses to the brutal assault besides the two parties involved. That is entirely, factually incorrect, Silas interrupted smoothly, a dangerous smile playing on his lips. The defense calls Mrs. Eleanor Higgins to the stand. The heavy, soundproof wooden doors at the very back of the courtroom slowly pushed open. Mrs. Higgins, 72 years old, relying heavily on a silver-handled cane, walked slowly down the center aisle. She looked incredibly frail, wearing a simple knitted cardigan over a floral dress, but her jaw was set with absolute, unyielding determination. Winston literally gripped the heavy wooden bench in front of him so hard his knuckles turned stark white. He had personally sent his corporate driver to bribe this elderly woman the day before. He honestly thought his money had bought her silence. He thought he owned her. Mrs. Higgins carefully navigated the steps to the witness stand. She raised her right hand and swore the oath. Silas approached her with the utmost gentleness and respect, completely dropping his predatory courtroom demeanor. Mrs. Higgins, for the record, you live directly below the luxury apartment leased by Harrison and Valerie? Is that correct? Silas asked. I do, she said, her voice surprisingly strong, carrying clearly across the silent room. Can you please tell this court, in your own words, exactly what you heard coming from their apartment on the morning of July 18th? Mrs. Higgins adjusted her glasses and looked directly across the room at Valerie. Valerie physically shrank back in her heavy leather chair, her fake tears completely drying up, replaced by genuine, visceral panic. I heard a massive, screaming argument about stolen wedding money, Mrs. Higgins stated clearly, ensuring the court reporter caught every single word. I heard Harrison, speaking in a very calm but firm voice, threaten to call the bank and the police about wire fraud. He mentioned a large sum of money being taken without his permission. And then, plain as day, echoing through the open balcony windows, I heard Valerie scream at the absolute top of her lungs, I am going to smash your head in. The courtroom erupted in loud, chaotic whispers. The bailiff had to shout heavily for order. Judge Harper leaned forward, her eyes locked onto the elderly witness. And then what exactly happened, ma'am? Silas asked softly, guiding her through the testimony. Immediately after she screamed that terrible threat, I heard the incredibly loud, unmistakable crash of heavy glass shattering violently against wood. A split second later, I heard a heavy, painful thud on the floor. Throughout the entire ordeal, from beginning to end, Harrison never raised his voice once. Not a single time. He sounded perfectly calm. Sterling desperately jumped to his feet, trying to aggressively and ruthlessly discredit the elderly woman to save his failing case. Objection, Your Honor. This is absurd. Mrs. Higgins is elderly. Her hearing is completely unreliable. Furthermore, she is a known, documented neighborhood gossip who has filed multiple HOA complaints against my client over noise issues. She clearly holds a grudge. We have strong reason to believe she is being financially compensated by the defense for fabricating this ridiculous, slanderous story. Mrs. Higgins did not wait for the judge to rule on the highly insulting objection. She reached a shaking hand into her oversized, worn floral handbag. Her hands were shaking not from fear or senility, but from deep, righteous anger. She pulled out a thick, heavy, unmarked manila envelope. She tossed it aggressively onto the polished wooden railing of the witness stand. The heavy, muffled thud of the package hitting the wood echoed in the quiet room. I am absolutely not being paid a single dime by Harrison, Mrs. Higgins said, glaring with absolute, unfiltered disgust at Winston sitting in the gallery. But I was certainly offered a massive payment by that despicable man sitting right there. His personal driver came to my door yesterday afternoon. He handed me this exact envelope. There is exactly $25,000 in untraceable sequential cash inside it. He explicitly told me to completely forget what I heard, so his precious daughter could get a favorable divorce settlement and walk away clean. I might be old, and I might be surviving on my late husband's fixed public pension, but my integrity and my soul are not for sale to arrogant bullies. The explosion that immediately followed Mrs. Higgins's devastating testimony was something straight out of a cinematic thriller. Sterling looked like he wanted the polished marble floor to open up and swallow him whole. He dropped his pen, staring at the envelope of cash in sheer horror. Valerie buried her face in her hands, completely dropping the fragile victim act, sobbing hysterically out of sheer panic, embarrassment, and the realization that she was facing perjury charges. But Winston completely, spectacularly lost his mind. The patriarch, the man who arrogantly believed his vast commercial real estate empire and massive bank accounts made him a literal god among men, stood up in the middle of the crowded gallery, completely ignoring all basic courtroom decorum. His face was a dark, dangerous, terrifying shade of crimson. The veins in his neck were bulging. This is an absolute, orchestrated outrage. A total malicious setup. Winston screamed at the top of his lungs, pointing a violently shaking finger directly at my face. He is a worthless, gold-digging parasite. He heavily manipulated this entire pathetic situation. He has absolutely nothing. No money, no corporate power, no future. I am going to completely destroy your pathetic little investment firm, Harrison. I am going to make a single phone call right now, and your entire professional life, your salary, your career, will be completely over by lunchtime. I own this city. I own the politicians. You are a dead man walking. Judge Harper slammed her heavy wooden gavel down so incredibly hard I genuinely thought the handle might snap in two. Mr. Winston, you will sit down and remain completely, absolutely silent this instant, or I will have the armed bailiffs arrest you for contempt of court, witness tampering, and threatening a respondent right this very second. One more word, and you are going to jail. Winston sneered, breathing heavily like a cornered animal, but he slowly, reluctantly sat back down onto the wooden bench. He's completely broke, Winston muttered loudly enough for the front rows and the court reporter to clearly hear. He thinks he can play with the big boys, but he's a nobody. He's going to lose everything. I finally stood up from the defense table. I didn't look at Valerie, who was still weeping into her hands. I didn't look at the aggressive, defeated lawyer. I looked directly, piercingly at Winston. The cold, calculating, absolute clarity my father had painstakingly taught me in our backyard all those years ago was vibrating in my veins. I am not broke, Winston, I said, my voice cutting through the remaining heavy tension in the room like a razor blade. I didn't yell. I spoke with absolute, terrifying calm. And I absolutely do not need to play with the big boys, because I own the playground. Right on cue, as if orchestrated by a master director, the heavy mahogany doors at the back of the courtroom swung open one final, dramatic time. The tall, incredibly imposing, immaculately dressed figure of Mr. Kensington, the public-facing CEO of Vanguard Holdings, stepped inside. He was flanked on either side by three high-powered, ruthless corporate litigators carrying thick, legally binding leather binders. Kensington's custom-tailored suit easily cost more than the luxury cars parked in the courthouse parking lot. He walked down the center aisle with the absolute, unquestionable authority of a man who personally controls billions of dollars in global assets. He didn't stop at the gallery to find a seat. He walked straight past Winston, whose jaw had literally, physically dropped open in pure, unadulterated shock and growing horror. Kensington confidently approached the low wooden partition separating the public gallery from the official court tables. "Your Honor," Silas said smoothly, gesturing gracefully to the new corporate arrivals. "I deeply apologize for the sudden interruption, but highly relevant, fully verified financial documents pertaining to the immediate division of marital assets, and directly addressing the severe financial threats just made on the record by the petitioner's father, have just arrived via secure corporate courier." Judge Harper looked highly intrigued, leaning forward on her elbows. "Approach the bench." Kensington stepped forward with quiet dignity, handing a thick, heavily sealed folder directly to the judge. Then, he turned and handed an identical, heavy folder to Sterling, who looked completely bewildered and terrified to open it. Finally, Kensington turned slowly to look directly at Winston sitting in the gallery. "What exactly is this?" Sterling asked nervously, frantically flipping through the dense financial spreadsheets, corporate ownership structures, and aggressive legal mandates. "That," I said, my voice echoing in the total, breathless silence of the courtroom, "is the absolute, terrifying reality of your situation." I stepped completely out from behind the defendant's table, ensuring there was nothing between me and Winston. Winston has spent the last 48 agonizing hours aggressively threatening to completely destroy my small boutique investment firm. He repeatedly, publicly called me a worthless gold digger. He aggressively forced me to sign a draconian, highly restrictive prenuptial agreement under extreme duress to protect his precious commercial real estate inheritance from me. He firmly, arrogantly believed his family's generational wealth gave them the unmitigated, divine right to steal $15,000 from my family, physically assault me, bribe elderly witnesses, and commit blatant perjury to ruin my life. I paused, letting the heavy, suffocating silence stretch for a long moment, ensuring every single word landed with maximum, devastating impact. What Winston completely failed to research, because his arrogance blinded him, I continued, is that my small boutique firm is merely a highly secretive, aggressive holding company. I am the sole founder, the primary architect, and the majority voting shareholder of Vanguard Holdings. The man standing right there, Mr. Kensington, is my CEO. He works for me. Winston gasped out loud. The sound was incredibly audible across the quiet room. He physically grabbed his chest, his face turning an unhealthy shade of gray. He knew exactly what Vanguard Holdings was. Every single major player in the global commercial real estate sector knew Vanguard. Vanguard was the apex predator of the financial food chain, the massive entity that swallowed struggling empires whole. And as of exactly 8 a.m. this morning, I said, turning to look dead into Winston's horrified, panicked eyes, Vanguard Holdings officially triggered the hidden early repayment clause on the massive, high-interest corporate loans currently funding your new, highly publicized warehouse expansion project. Because your daughter committed documented felony wire fraud by stealing our joint wedding money to pay off her brother's illegal gambling debts to organized crime, your entire family and corporate structure are now officially considered a high-risk financial liability by our board. We have formally initiated aggressive, hostile foreclosure proceedings on your primary downtown distribution hub. Your company is heavily, fatally over-leveraged, Winston, and I hold all of the paper, every single dime. The color drained entirely from Winston's face, leaving him looking like a deflated, terrifyingly old man. He looked like he was genuinely going to pass out right there on the wooden bench. He desperately tried to speak, to form a coherent sentence, to offer a deal, but only a dry, desperate, pathetic croak came out of his throat. He looked slowly over at Valerie. She was staring at me with a look of pure, uncomprehending terror, her hands shaking violently. The grand illusion of their absolute, untouchable power had just been completely, violently, and publicly shattered into a million irreversible pieces. "You genuinely thought you could easily bury me with your money?" I said quietly, the heavy finality of the statement hanging in the cold, air-conditioned air. "But you didn't realize I was the bank. You don't own me, Winston. I own you." Judge Harper took off her reading glasses, rubbing the bridge of her nose. She looked down at the massive stack of untraceable cash Mrs. Higgins had bravely provided. She looked at the deeply incriminating corporate email regarding Felix's blatant perjury. And then she looked with utter, unfiltered disgust at the shrinking, terrified, pathetic figures of Valerie and her parents. "This court has seen more than enough of this circus," Judge Harper declared, her voice ringing with absolute, unyielding authority. "The petitioner's request for a permanent restraining order against Harrison is denied with extreme prejudice. Furthermore, based on the highly credible, courageous eyewitness testimony of Mrs. Higgins, the undeniable documentary evidence of blatant witness tampering, and the deeply concerning, fraudulent nature of this entire petition, I am immediately granting a reverse permanent protective order in favor of the respondent Harrison. Valerie is legally, permanently barred from coming within 500 feet of Harrison, his residence, his vehicle, or his place of business. If she violates this, she will be arrested immediately without bail. The judge then glared directly, furiously at Winston in the gallery. And as for you, sir, I am aggressively referring this entire disgraceful matter, including the massive bribery attempt of an elderly witness and the direct solicitation of perjury, directly to the district attorney's office and the federal authorities for immediate criminal investigation. You are completely out of line, your arrogance is astounding, and your money will absolutely not save you in a federal criminal courtroom. We are completely adjourned. The heavy wooden gavel slammed down. The loud, sharp sound was like a gunshot echoing through the room, officially signaling the absolute, final execution of their arrogant dynasty. The aftermath of that single, explosive morning in court was incredibly swift, utterly merciless, and absolutely devastating for their entire family structure. I walked calmly out of that county courthouse into the blinding, beautiful July sun alongside Silas and Kensington, breathing the fresh, hot air for the first time in what felt like a lifetime. I didn't look back at the people desperately crying and shouting at each other in the marble hallway. I simply got into the air-conditioned back of Kensington's waiting corporate town car and went straight back to work to finalize the dismantling of their empire. Exactly 6 months later, the aggressive divorce proceedings were fully, legally finalized. It was one of the fastest, most brutal, and entirely one-sided divorces Silas had ever legally processed in his entire career. Because I had willingly, happily signed their incredibly restrictive, draconian prenuptial agreement before the wedding, Valerie was completely, legally barred from touching a single cent of my massive Vanguard Holdings fortune. The irony of the situation was incredibly, deeply poetic. The very legal document Winston had aggressively forced upon me, thinking I was a desperate gold digger after their real estate inheritance, became an impenetrable, ironclad shield protecting my actual wealth. Valerie walked away from the incredibly brief marriage with absolutely nothing but a permanent restraining order heavily attached to her public record, a completely ruined reputation, and a massive mountain of heavy legal debt from her expensive lawyers. The subsequent financial collapse of Winston's once mighty commercial real estate and logistics empire was highly publicized in every local and regional business journal. Vanguard Holdings aggressively, methodically finalized the hostile foreclosure on his main distribution hubs. Without those incredibly crucial central assets, Winston's entire logistics company suffered a catastrophic, irreversible supply chain failure. He couldn't fulfill his contracts. He couldn't service his other massive, high-interest debts. Within 90 days of the court hearing, his heavily over-leveraged company was legally forced to file for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. The sprawling, heavily gated suburban estate where we had that awful, condescending Thanksgiving dinner was aggressively seized by the bank and quickly sold at a public auction to a tech billionaire who completely bulldozed it. Winston went from being a feared, wealthy corporate titan who genuinely believed he could buy human beings and dictate reality, to a deeply disgraced, heavily investigated man facing multiple serious criminal charges for aggressive witness tampering, corporate bribery, and financial fraud. The truly tragic, deeply pathetic part of the entire situation was watching how quickly their fiercely loyal family turned on each other like starving wolves the absolute second the money completely dried up. Without Winston's deep, endless pockets to constantly bail him out of trouble, Derek's dangerous, mounting gambling debts finally caught up with him. Desperate, terrified of the violent bookies he owed, Derek actually broke into his own parents' newly rented, severely downsized apartment in the middle of the night. He stole the last remaining pieces of Beatrice's expensive, uninsured heirloom jewelry, along with their emergency cash, to fund his cowardly escape across state lines. When Valerie ultimately discovered that her precious golden child brother had stolen what little financial inheritance and security she had left, she completely snapped. The family loyalty she had aggressively screamed about in our kitchen was entirely conditional. She immediately filed aggressive criminal theft charges against her own brother. The family that constantly, loudly preached about loyalty, the family that violently attacked me for trying to stop a theft, ended up completely destroying each other in a series of deeply vicious, highly public legal lawsuits. Beatrice, a woman who once treated country club staff like garbage and looked down on anyone making a normal salary, was forced to take a minimum wage retail job at a local department store makeup counter just to help pay for Winston's mounting astronomical legal defense fees. They completely consumed themselves. Their absolute, unchecked arrogance was their ultimate undoing, exactly as my father had warned me. As for the people who actually mattered, the people who stood by the truth when it was incredibly difficult, I made absolutely sure they were deeply, permanently taken care of. Felix, my former groomsman who sold his soul and our friendship for a corporate real estate contract, lost absolutely everything. The moment the severe perjury allegations and the bribery email hit the public court record, his other real estate investors panicked. They rapidly pulled their funding, entirely blacklisting him from the industry. He was forced to abruptly close his consulting firm, sell his house at a massive loss, and leave the state in total, humiliating disgrace. But Mrs. Higgins, the incredibly brave, elderly woman who refused a massive, life-changing cash bribe and stood up for the absolute truth in a room full of powerful liars? I didn't just write her a thank you note. Through a quiet, anonymous Vanguard real estate subsidiary, I aggressively purchased the entire luxury apartment building where we had lived. I immediately, legally voided Mrs. Higgins's standard lease, permanently transferring the absolute deed of her specific apartment directly into her name, completely free and clear of any taxes or HOA fees for the rest of her life. I also quietly established a robust, heavily funded medical trust fund managed by Silas's firm to ensure she would never, ever have to worry about the rising cost of her daily medications or relying on her meager pension ever again. She had shown more raw integrity and courage in 10 minutes on that terrifying witness stand than Valerie's entire bloodline had shown in a century of existence. A full year after the divorce was legally finalized and the dust had completely settled, I found myself standing alone in the master bathroom of a beautiful, incredibly quiet new home I had purchased on the wooded outskirts of the city. I was looking deeply at my own reflection in the mirror, tracing the faint stress lines around my eyes. The physical and intense emotional exhaustion of the entire ordeal had finally, truly faded, leaving behind a profound, unshakable sense of absolute peace and clarity. I thought about my father, Marcus, more than anything else during that incredible, transformative year of rebuilding my life. I heard his voice clearly in my mind. Different world, same feat. Never meet force with force. Step off the line. Let their arrogance take them to the ground. For a very long time, when I was much younger, I honestly thought his grueling backyard wrestling lessons were strictly, entirely about physical self-defense. I thought he was simply preparing me for a violent, random encounter with a stranger in a dark parking lot. I didn't truly understand the profound, philosophical depth of his wisdom until I was 32 years old, standing in a freezing courthouse, watching a millionaire actively try to destroy my life, my salary, and my future with lies and bribes. The greatest danger I ever faced in my life wasn't a mugger in a dark alleyway. The greatest danger was the deeply toxic, highly manipulative, incredibly entitled environment I had willingly, blindly invited into my own home. Valerie was someone who cried beautifully and convincingly during her wedding vows. She probably genuinely meant them in whatever deeply limited, incredibly selfish way she was emotionally capable of meaning things, right up until the exact moment she didn't get her way. She firmly believed that surviving a consequence meant she was the victim, never once pausing to consider that she was the absolute cause of the destruction. I am not bitter about the marriage, which often heavily surprises people when I tell them this deeply personal story. I don't harbor deep, consuming, toxic hatred for Valerie or her parents anymore. They are simply ghosts to me now, cautionary tales of what happens when generational wealth completely rots the moral compass and destroys human empathy. I date again now, incredibly carefully, incredibly slowly. I am currently with an amazing, grounded, brilliant woman who works long hours as a pediatric nurse. She is someone who has never once, in 2 wonderful years of dating, made me feel like my boundaries, my need for privacy, or my caution were an insult to her. We actively, honestly talk about finances. We share responsibilities equally. We don't hide bank accounts, and we build solid, undeniable trust daily. We are currently discussing starting a college fund for our future children, building a life based on reality, not a fabricated image. I firmly decided to keep this story and share it on this platform because I genuinely, deeply believe it is a story worth telling honestly and without embellishment. It is not just a satisfying viral story about a guy who got sweet revenge on his deeply entitled in-laws and won a massive lawsuit. It is fundamentally a story about an incredibly wise, loving father who spent 2 long, dedicated decades meticulously preparing his son for a dark, terrifying moment he desperately prayed would never actually happen. It is a profound reminder to everyone listening that true strength isn't about how loudly you can yell, how aggressively you can swing a heavy vase, or how much money you can throw at a corrupt lawyer to hide your sins. True strength is deeply, fundamentally rooted in your ability to stand perfectly still in the absolute center of a chaotic, terrifying storm, completely knowing your own boundaries, and refusing to compromise your fundamental integrity to appease deeply toxic people. You don't have to desperately decide what kind of person you are going to be in the heat of the moment if you already built your character years before the crisis actually hits. You cannot miraculously change manipulative, deeply entitled people. You cannot love them into becoming honest. You cannot buy their loyalty, but you can absolutely choose to stop playing their incredibly rigged, destructive games. You can choose to step off the center line, establish an ironclad boundary, and let their own massive, unearned arrogance carry them straight into the dirt. Thank you so much for listening to my story today. I know it was incredibly long, but some truths absolutely require the full, detailed context to be understood. Setting boundaries with toxic family members, especially those who use money, inheritance, or guilt as a weapon to control you, is one of the hardest things a human being can do. Have you ever faced something similar with your own family? Have you ever had to walk away from people who thought they owned you because of their wealth or status? Share your story in the comments below. Reading your unique experiences helps all of us remember that we are not alone in these struggles. And please, don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss the next journey. Stay strong, protect your peace, and never let anyone make you a victim in your own life.